This is hell.
Black antebellum abolitionist activists' long campaign against slavery eventually turned to violence, forcing the United States to finally end slavery. Here to tell us what she has discovered and what no other historian had beforehand, historian Kellie Carter Jackson is author of Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Welcome to This Is Hell, Kellie.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being on. Kellie is a 19th century historian in the Department of Africana Studies at Wellesley College. You can follow Kellie on Twitter at K Carter Jackson, and you can find out more about Kellie at her website, KellieCarterJackson.com. You quote 19th century African American physician, apothecary, abolitionist, and author James McCune Smith, writing, "Our white brethren cannot understand us unless we speak to them in their own language. They recognize only the philosophy of force." To what extent is that still the case today? Because in the Black Lives Matter movement, not that they employ force, but their strategy, like many activists today, even in the Extinction Rebellion activism that's happening in the UK and now coming to the US, it's one of confrontation, of being more confrontational to those you oppose. And we've seen the success of this confrontation here in Chicago as it led to Mayor Rahm Emanuel no longer being able to make public appearances and eventually bowing out of the race and not running for mayor. So again, while confrontation and force are not the same, to what extent do white people still only react to the philosophy of force?
Oh, that's a really good question. So in my work, I really make clear the distinction between force and violence. So while violence is always forceful, force is not necessarily violent. And so there are a lot of ways in which Black abolitionists and contemporary activists make use of force and really make a compelling case for getting people to meet their demands and using force to create reform. So in the Black Lives Matter movement, I think a lot of their activism has been centered around nonviolence. And that's really great because we've seen the ways in which they've been able to push a lot of progress and do that nonviolently. In the 19th century, it's a little bit different. Black abolitionists are employing force and violence, and really any means necessary in order to bring about the abolition of slavery. I tell my students it's a little trickier talking about force and freedom and violence today because in the 19th century, we can sort of all readily concede that slavery is wrong, that slavery was awful. But when we look at systemic racism today and all its different reincarnations, it's a little bit harder to tackle with the activism of the 19th century.
You write, what vexed McCune Smith the most was the notion that British emancipation had been a boon conferred rather than a right seized upon and held. This is the British emancipation that had taken place elsewhere, obviously. Consequently, he mocked celebrants by mimicking an 1848 blackface minstrel song, "Massa Give Me Holiday." Were Black Americans to hope for abolition as a gift from slave owners acting of their own free will? According to McCune Smith, true freedom could not be bestowed. It had to be won. Can freedom ever be bestowed, ever be given as a gift by those who are free to those who are not? Do we know if freedom has ever been voluntarily given by the free to those who are not?
I'm going to say no. And, I'd love to hear other people's opinions on this, but I don't think so. When I teach American history, and for that matter, when all historians are teaching any form of history, we benchmark history with violence. So violence becomes all of the little pinpoints on the timetable. So if you're thinking about the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, the Civil War, World War I, World War II, Vietnam, post 9/11, all of these moments pinpoint progress or the lack thereof, but for the most part, progress. So when we think about how change is procured, a lot of times it's violence that allows these major changes to happen. And so when I talk about freedoms given versus freedoms won, I think what we respect more, what we celebrate more, is actually freedoms won. I think if Americans are sort of honest with themselves, we really do have a romance with violence and revolution and freedom. And, we quote Patrick Henry's "Give me liberty or give me death." I think these sentiments are really powerful in understanding how we see the abolition of slavery and how we see the procurement of people's freedom. Oftentimes, it's coming with a gun. Even if you look at British emancipation, yes, they freed their slaves nonviolently, but what precipitated their emancipation was the Baptist War, also known as the Christmas Rebellion. And it was Jamaica's largest rebellion on the record books. And when this happened, the British government was clear they did not want to be Haiti. They did not want to be the Haitian Revolution. So they wind up freeing their slaves without having a revolution. But rebellion was definitely there and one of the major impetus for emancipation.
You write that in the history of the movement to abolish slavery, the shift toward violence among African Americans remains largely unaddressed. Why does that remain largely unaddressed? Is stepping away from or not reporting on or not researching that violence, is that because they're trying to, it's an attempt to enforce some other narrative that is
Mm.
nonviolent? So why has it not gone addressed?
I think it's because, it's an uncomfortable. Violence can be an uncomfortable topic, and I think it's easier to package the Underground Railroad as stories of escape and fleeing or flight, and not really talk about that. Oftentimes, fleeing required fighting. That violence was necessary in a lot of cases for people to obtain their freedom. So I think it requires a nuanced analysis of violence. What I really try to do is make a careful critique of how violence becomes a tool of utility in the movement. And not to dismiss it. I think a lot of times when people are employing violence, we dismiss them as fanatics or as crazy. Someone like John Brown, we say, oh, this would have never been successful. But I think that John Brown was not too far off to think that violence would work because he looked at the American Revolution and he looked at the Haitian Revolution and he said, in order to bring about change, violence has been the great accelerator. So I think that we need to have an honest discussion about violence because if we don't, it presents the idea that the Civil War is just this spontaneous, unfortunate outcome that is not precipitated by all these other movements and moments.
You ask, is violence a valid means of producing social change? Whenever there is violence at events demanding social change, the media argues that the violence delegitimizes the cause. Can violence
Mhm.
undermine efforts for social change?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it all depends on the context. I think in the 21st century, we can't handle violence as a tool of political protest because we can't handle nonviolence as a tool of political protest. So I use the example of Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick's nonviolent protest. He kneels with the flag. He doesn't, put middle fingers up to the flag. He doesn't turn his back on the flag, but he simply chooses to kneel. And in kneeling, which is typically a posture of servitude or a posture of subservience, we kneel in prayer. We kneel when we're proposing to someone. But the backlash that he received from kneeling towards the flag is something that we're still grappling with today. And so it makes me ask the question, well, if we can't handle kneeling in the face of the flag, how much more can we handle people who are using force and violence to be heard? Um, there's a great quote I use in the book by Martin Luther King Jr. where he says, "A riot is the language of the unheard. A riot is the language of the unheard." And I really feel like, when oppressed people are pushed to their limit, that the only ways they feel they can be heard if they don't have access to the bullet, if nonviolent resistance is not being heard, then riots and violence become one of the ways in which people respond to them quickly.
I'm glad you brought that up. That was going to be a question about 20 minutes from now, probably. But how is violence a language? How do we view violence differently when we
Mhm.
understand it as trying to deliver a message?
Yeah, so in the book, I talk about violence being a political language. And I think this is really important because for Black abolitionists in particular, free Black people do not have the ability to vote. There are a few small percentages of Black people who can vote, but the stipulations in order to do that are extremely high. It requires land ownership, it requires wealth. And so I asked the question, how do you bring about political change or social change or economic change when you don't have possession of the traditional channels to bring about that change, when you don't have the vote, when you don't have the ballot? So a lot of the ways in which Black abolitionists were able to communicate their political desires was through force and was through violence. And to be honest, I was surprised by how much throughout the book and throughout history people responded to violence in a lot of ways quite positively. So, and it allowed Black abolitionists to make a lot of progress, especially when it came down to the fugitive slave law. You know, Black abolitionists are developing their own quasi-military groups. They're protecting their communities. They are putting slave catchers' lives at risk. And so I think when slave catchers and kidnappers realize, well, I have just as much to lose, or I have a life to lose in this game, then in a lot of ways, retrieving fugitive slaves is sort of the deadliest catch of the 19th century. That it puts a lot of people on edge, and it allows fugitives to protect themselves when they're able to use force to prevent themselves from being returned to slavery.
And you write historiography typically follows the chronological pattern of moral suasion in the 1830s,
Hmm.
political abolition in the 1840s, and separatism and emigration in the 1850s. Some historians see the shift from moral suasion to violence as one of declension, with
Hmm.
African Americans giving into despair in the wake of the Fugitive Slave Act of
Hmm.
1850. So, were things actually getting worse for
Mm.
slaves as we got closer to the Civil War? And why?
Hmm.
Was this a reaction to violence being perpetrated by Black abolitionist activists, or what was the
Hmm.
reason for things getting worse for slaves as we get to the Civil War? Because
Yeah.
I think the assumption is that slowly and slowly slaves earned their freedom. And the way that you describe it is
Mm.
that is not the case
No,
whatsoever.
quite the opposite. It's quite the opposite, and things get it's tremendously worse. So when the abolitionist movement sort of has its formal debut in the 1830s, their goal is to do everything nonviolently. They are experiencing a second great awakening, so there's this spiritual revival. People believe that Christ is coming back, and so that you ought to repent, and that that slavery is a sin. All of these ideas are associated with morality and spirituality. Um, but I think by the time you get to the 1850s, the abolitionists have been at this movement for about 20 years. And in that 20 years, they've seen slavery expand westward. By the time of the Civil War, slaves are now 4 million in their population. Every piece of legislation that debuted in the antebellum period favored slaveholders. So there's no new law that is created that helps the enslaved, that benefits Black abolitionists or free Black Americans. So they're not seeing any progress put in place. And with each new territory that comes into the Union, there is intense violence over whether or not these states will be free states or slave states, which will thereby give more political control to the slaveholding South or the free state North. Um, so it's becoming incredibly violent, and it's also becoming incredibly clear that slavery is not going to go away anytime soon. I like to tell my students nothing in history is inevitable. So the idea that slavery would just be abolished eventually is just not. It's just not so. It could have gone on easily for another 100 years if not for the abolitionists and their efforts.
But why wasn't the end of slavery inevitable? You write about how the founding fathers are what Black abolitionist activists were pointing towards, saying, look, they're telling us that we're guaranteed these freedoms, we're supposed to have all these
Hmm.
freedoms, and now we're not having these freedoms. So to what degree did the writing of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence,
Mm.
to what degree did that make the end of slavery inevitable?
Mm. I think that Black abolitionists took it upon themselves to say that we need to have both emancipation and equality. That emancipation by itself is incomplete. That if you do not give slaves, both Black people for that matter, the ability to be seen as equal to their white counterparts, then everything that the American Revolution fought for is a farce, is hypocrisy, or incomplete. A lot of times, what I see about Black leaders is that they're referencing the American Revolution, but they really see their model as the Haitian Revolution, because the Haitian Revolution not only freed their slaves, but also allowed equality for their enslaved people. And so they see the Haitian Revolution as their own precedent, as their own model for how they understand what revolution will entail and also what freedom and equality will entail. I use a really good quote by Joshua Easton. He's a famous Black abolitionist, and he says, we ought to attack the system of slavery, but if we don't also attack the spirit of slavery, that it won't matter if the system of slavery is overturned, if that spirit of slavery, which makes color a mark of degradation, still exists, we will have essentially lost all of our efforts. So I think that spirit of slavery is also something that we're still fighting today. The institution of slavery has clearly been abolished, but the spirit of slavery, the anti-Blackness sentiment, is very much with us, and the search for equality and equity is still very much with us. So it's something that I still see us grappling with, and that I still see Black people, and in particular Black abolitionists, as responsible for creating a more perfect union. Their whole desire was to perfect the union, to allow the union in the United States to live up to its creed of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
How can we exercise, then, that spirit of slavery?
That's a really good question. I think in the 19th century, they employed all kinds of tactics. So they're using the press, they're making speeches, they're going on tours, they're writing books, they're getting their narratives out there. They are developing grassroots activism on the ground, developing their own protection societies, developing their own refugee societies for fugitive slaves. The list goes on and on and on. They're even developing military groups before the Civil War starts. They're literally rehearsing for war, rehearsing to be in battle before the war starts. So I see that activism is so instructive when you fast forward 100 years, 150 years into the 21st century. I'm excited when I see people are, taking to social media, using print or using speech as an avenue to talk about these issues, to raise these awareness about these issues. I see, what I do as a professor as my own form of activism. I'm constantly trying to get my students to understand how inequality works and how oppression works and how to combat that. So I want my students to really be student activists. Now, this doesn't mean I want them to get arrested, but it means I want them to act on what they know, right? I want them to be able to take the knowledge that they have about how systems of oppression have really persecuted people and use that knowledge and information to combat that oppression and to combat that marginalization.
Oh, I just started thinking about how then I'm sure that you are a target for conservatives who think that there shouldn't be activism or politics, or that there's some sort of liberal cabal happening or even progressive cabal happening in universities. How do you juxtapose that desire to have your students act on their information with the supposed objectivity that is supposed to be taking place in a classroom?
Well, it's funny. I tell my students a lot of times that nothing is objective. So facts may be, completely objective. We know that the Civil War happened, right? But how we understand causes, how we understand consequences, those are completely subjective. So what I do is I give my students as much of the facts as I possibly can. I give them the primary resources. I tell them these are the succession documents that came out in the Civil War. This is what South Carolina is saying. This is what Texas is saying, right? So that they have that as a tool to understand what the historical context was for that moment. Now, what they make of that, how they interpret that, is completely up to them, but at least the facts of it are there. So when the South says we are leaving because of slavery, you can't say, well, this was about states' rights, unless you're saying states' rights to keep their slaves. These things become very explicit when you look at the historical primary sources. So a lot of times I don't have to do that much work. I don't have to work that hard to convince them. I just have to show them what the facts are and allow them to use their critical thinking skills to interpret what is in front of them. But I also want them to be, critical about what they read. A lot of times we think that, encyclopedias are completely benign, but I've had textbooks that have had, 2 whole chapters on the history of Christianity and then 2 paragraphs on the history of Islam. Well, that emphasis is really political. What gets left out, what gets emphasized, what gets placed at the center, all of that is really, really political. And so I want my students to pay attention to those things. So the things that we think are not necessarily giving us an agenda are almost absolutely giving us an agenda all of the time. And it's our job to be able to teach students to recognize what that is and then decide for themselves.
We are speaking with historian Kellie Carter Jackson. She is author of Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. Kellie is co-editor of 2017's Reconsidering Roots, Race, Politics, and Memory, which has a foreword written by Henry Louis Gates Jr. You can find out more about Kellie at her website, KellieCarterJackson.com. You mentioned how the focus of black abolitionist activists in antebellum America, they were not as much focused on the 1776 here in the United States as much as 1804 in Haiti and the uprising and the slave rebellion, which led to the revolution in Haiti. So, but black abolitionist violence seemed to have taken place later on. Why did that happen in 1804? And unless I'm reading your book incorrectly, the black abolitionist violence doesn't start till decades later.
Yeah, it doesn't. I think that that's a really good question. I think that there's small pockets of activism that are taking place all throughout the early 19th century, but it's not a national conversation really until David Walker's appeal. So David Walker issues his famous appeal in 4 parts in 1829, and he uses his pamphlet to spread it all throughout the North and South. He uses black sailors in order to get the word out as much as he possibly can. And having his, pamphlet out and also having abolitionist newspapers printing their own papers creates this gag law in which Congress starts creating laws about, anti-slavery literature. But I think it's really difficult to get sort of consensus and a movement going until the 1830s, until you get this group of abolitionists, people like William Lloyd Garrison, people like Gerrit Smith, people like Frederick Douglass, who are starting to make the movement official and to really give it a name and a brand, and then allow it to speak to the current political and social context that's taking place in the 1830s. So it's interesting, when the abolitionist movement really starts out, they are the subject of intense amounts of violence. There are a lot of anti-abolitionist riots, anti-abolitionist mob attacks. But the black community is bearing the brunt of that violence. So their black churches are destroyed, their homes are burned down, their orphanages are burned down. And this backlash to the formalization of the abolitionist movement is what causes a lot of black leadership to say, hey, turning the other cheek is not really effective. Turning the other cheek is not going to work. And we need to be more forceful in our attempts of understanding how slavery is going to come to an end. I think that a lot of times when we think about the institution of slavery, it is created in violence, it is sustained in violence. And so the logical next step would be that it would be overthrown in violence. And so black leaders gave their white counterparts, I think, an opportunity to do it their way, to do it nonviolently, because they were helpful. They were happy to have the allyship. But as the decades, go on, they began to see how moral suasion was really ineffective in bringing about change. So I think that there are certain political windows that had to open in order for black abolitionists to have more of a platform. And the 1830s, 40s, and certainly the 50s is when they're able to do it.
Violence toward abolitionists, when we hear about that, and this is one of those myths that I really always want to dispel. So that was only going on in the South, right?
No. No, I think that the North is just as violent as the South. The North is just as racist as the South. I think we get these myths a lot about the North having this higher, moral ground. But I tell my students all the time that there's a difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. There are a lot of Northerners that were anti-slavery, but they were not abolitionists at all. And this is because, you could live in the state of Illinois and that be a free state. and simultaneously, as Illinois did, create a law that barred Black people from entering the territory and entering the state. And they didn't want Black people in the state because they didn't want their free labor undermined by slave labor or by Black menial labor. And so I think that's a really important distinction to make, that the North is not it's not this bastion of love for Black people. It's simply anti-slavery because they understand how slavery undercuts their economic bottom line. No one's going to pay them $10 an hour when they've got a slave for life who can do it forever. So that is where the sentiment comes from. People like Abraham Lincoln, for example, intensely anti-slavery, but he is not an abolitionist. Abolitionists are people who are actively advocating for the end of slavery. And so I tell my students also, when I was in college, my professor said that the abolitionists approached slavery as though it was a Save the Whales campaign, right? So they would be like, save the whales, don't hurt the whales. But then simultaneously, they were like, but whales can't vote and whales can't marry my daughter, right? The emphasis on Black abolitionists is important because while white abolitionists could push the end of slavery or the abolition of slavery, they weren't necessarily pushing equality. And Black abolitionists differ on a lot of things, but where they have solidarity is both emancipation and equality. And it's a tough fight in the North just as much as it is in the South.
And just because I want to stress this point, not only was slavery getting worse as we got closer to the Civil War, was anti-slavery activism increasingly criminalized as we get closer to the Civil War.
Absolutely, absolutely. So when the Fugitive Slave Law gets instituted, well, it actually gets revamped. The Fugitive Slave Law had been on the books since 1793. If you've read Erica Dunbar's Never Caught, she talks about George Washington using the Fugitive Slave Law to retrieve his runaway slaves. But when it gets revamped in the 1850s, they actually put teeth on the law. And so they said, if you are running away, a U.S. Marshal can deputize anyone on the spot and have them catch a runaway slave. And that if you said, no, I'm not having any part in this, you could be subject to a $1,000 fine. You could be put in prison for a year. And so Northerners really get mobilized by the Fugitive Slave Law because they feel as though Southerners are making them sort of de facto employees of slaveholders because they're put in place to retrieve and return their enslaved people. So it really becomes toxic after that law is instituted because the repercussions are so harsh if you get caught harboring fugitive slaves. If you get caught, even with anti-slavery literature was banned all throughout the South. You could be, thrown in prison if you were caught with the North Star or caught with an issue of the Liberator. So your life was at risk when you engaged in abolitionism. It was not something that people did. It was not something that it was common for you to be. About less than 1% of the population was made up of abolitionists. So while we think that they make up the North or northern populations, they're really a small percentage of the North.
Did a lack of response by the government to demands of Black abolitionist activists of the 1830s through moral suasion, the 1840s of political abolition, and the 1850s of emigration and separatism, did that lead to violence, the lack of response by the government, or was violence always a part of abolitionism throughout this era?
I would say the latter. I think violence has always been a part of abolitionism in really small ways and also in really big ways. So when we think of Elijah Lovejoy, who is a famous abolitionist in Illinois who has his printing press destroyed, and eventually he winds up being killed by an anti-abolitionist mob. It's Black people who are also being targeted in that community outside of Alton, Illinois as well. And they say, we're not taking this anymore, and they start to collect arms in their community to prevent themselves from being attacked individually and collectively by anti-abolitionist mobs. So that's taking place, in the 1830s. In the 1840s, you have people like Henry Highland Garnett that's giving his famous speech telling slaves to rise up to fight against their masters, to remember that they are in the millions and that they have the power to affect change with their violence. And in the 1850s, I talk about the Christiana resistance, where in 1851, four slaves run away to William Parker's house. William Parker is a famous black abolitionist and had a reputation for housing fugitive slaves. And when Edward Gorsuch, the master of these four slaves, comes to his door to retrieve his property, he's killed. And William Parker says something really powerful. He says, as Edward Gorsuch lay lying on the ground, dying, the women put it into him, right? That black women basically, I surmise, slit his throat, put his death, hastened his death quickly. But we think about all of these incidents, which some become national, some just become local phenomenons. But all throughout this period, black people are pushing back and trying to assert their humanity and trying to defend themselves either individually or collectively.
You write, others see the antebellum period as the moment in which the maturation of a black nationalist consciousness calcified. I align my work with the more recent scholarship of Manisha Sinha, Patrick Rael, Matthew Calvin, W. Caleb McDaniel, who see this moment as part of the creation of an alternative revolutionary tradition in the age of revolution. I see black abolitionism, you write, as a movement that began almost at the inception of Atlantic world slavery and understood the idea and experience of violence more than any other group. Why do we erase slavery's history of it always facing resistance by the enslaved from the very beginning of slavery, and how are slavery and even African Americans in general viewed differently when we acknowledge the resistance against slavery from its inception?
That's a really good point. You know, I talk about the book. The reason why I centralize black abolitionists is because I want to overturn the myth that the movement is a white man's struggle to end slavery, that only white sympathetic allies are at the helm of this or are pushing for this idea, as though black people had to be told that slavery was wrong, right? From the moment, you know, black people are brought to this country, Africans are brought to this country, they are pushing back, they are resisting in so many different ways to assert their humanity. And so for me, and with a lot of my other colleagues, it's really important for us to put black people at the center of their own efforts, to give them agency in their own efforts to abolish their own slavery for themselves, for their family members, for their communities, for their people at large. And that, I think, is something that I try to touch on over and over again in the book, is that black people were central to their own liberation. They're central to their own emancipation. That even when you look at, you know, the Civil War, it's black troops who are turning the tide of the war and allowing the North to have the victory that it does. It's the Emancipation Proclamation, but slaves have to leave on their own in order for the Emancipation Proclamation to work. So in a lot of ways, slavery dies on the ground because of the efforts of enslaved people who are leaving their plantations by the droves. So I really think it's important to highlight the centrality of black people's efforts in their own freedom, and to say that it starts when slavery starts, that it doesn't, that black people aren't waiting around for 100 of years and then all of a sudden they have this epiphany as though slavery is bad. That just doesn't even make sense. And when we think about it in any other context, right, people are always going to push back and defend themselves when they are oppressed.
And you were mentioning black soldiers fighting for the Union in the Civil War, and I only recently, in the last few years, saw a headline from a front page of a newspaper at the end of the Civil War, and the headline was "Black Division or Battalion was the division or battalion that took over Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy." And that's not something I learned in my very white history classes in East Detroit. So you explore, quote, black abolitionists shift from a campaign of moral persuasion in the 1830s to their push for more combative and violent strategies to end American slavery in the 1850s, and you draw scholarly attention to why black abolitionist leaders prioritize violence over nonviolence as a means of liberation. Was violence a means of last resort for black abolition activists? Did black activists turn to violence because nothing else worked?
Absolutely. I completely see this book as a study of last resorts, as an analysis of last resorts. I think that Black people gave presented opportunity after opportunity to do things nonviolently, to experience what happened in some ways in Great Britain, and that just doesn't take place. And Frederick Douglass has this really powerful quote. I use it to sort of round out the end of the book, in which he says, because of the Civil War, Americans learned and accepted more truth in 4 years of war than they did in 40 years of peace. And to me, it's just that quote is so poignant because it really talks about that the most valuable lessons that we learn, the most come through violence, right? The idea that progress or change really forces us uh, to accept some really uncomfortable truths, and that 40 years of peace and Americans still were not willing to relinquish the enslaved. It was the Civil War that did that. And I think until we can have a real reckoning with this country about why war was necessary, we'll never really be able to understand freedoms given versus freedoms won.
You refer to violence as political, or use the phrase political violence, by which you mean forceful or deadly acts that operate around a political agenda or motivation to produce change. And just because I want to make sure that people understand, in what ways then is political violence different from, say, terrorism? Because I often hear the two
Mm.
conflated.
Yes, they are not, and I distinguish them in the book as much as I possibly can because I don't want people to think that random acts of violence or acts of violence against Black people is the same thing as what the violence that Black people are employing. So a lot of times when I'm talking about political violence, what I'm really talking about is protective violence. That Black people are not necessarily going into the slaveholding South and slitting masters' throats and and killing white people all over the place. What they are doing is they are using violence to protect themselves. And so if someone is trying to enslave them and someone is trying to capture them, then they feel well within their rights to use deadly force to combat that. Um, and so what people like Frederick Douglass say a lot, and Quakers like Abby Kelly, is that slavery itself is warfare, that human bondage is warfare, that when you enslave another person, you in essence commit an act of war, and that those people are entitled to defend themselves and entitled to protect themselves. So while the Klan may be using terroristic violence to keep Black people subservient, to keep Black people inferior, to promote white supremacy. Black people are using political violence to bring about their freedom, to ensure their equality. Those are two different motives at the end of the day. One is fighting for liberation, one is fighting for freedom, one is fighting for protection of themselves and their communities. Another one is fighting to uphold a system of oppression, to uphold white supremacy.
You write many Black leaders began to argue that violent political discourse was completely in line with American religious traditions and early liberal Republican views. In what way was violence in line with the religious traditions? Doesn't religion always
Mm.
preach nonviolence exclusively? Or did religion end slavery?
Mm. Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of Black leaders have different thoughts about this. So, and I keep talking about Frederick Douglass a lot. He's in the book quite a bit, but he talks about this moment in which he says, slavery will only be overthrown by violence. And famous abolitionist Sojourner Truth is also at that speech. And she admonishes Frederick Douglass and she says, Frederick, is God dead? Do we not believe that God will do this for us? And then the next few lines, Douglass says to her, but she too changed her mind at the turn of the Civil War, that she saw the Civil War as God's vengeance, right? As God enacting punishment on slaveholders. And so people used the Bible or interpretations of particular scriptures to justify their acts of self defense. They thought and believed that self defense was godly. And so they're not necessarily sanctioning the wholesale of killing white people, but they are absolutely sanctioning self-defense in terms of slavery and in terms of bringing about the abolition for the enslaved. So I think you need to tease the things out a little bit in order for that to, for people to understand how spirituality is being used. It's not just carte blanche violence, but it is about protection and it is about the preservation of humanity. And because people believed in the 19th century that we were all creations, God's creation, being able to protect yourself was seen as godly. Um, so it's interesting. There's also a story I talk about in which John Anderson is a escaped slave. He runs away to Canada, and in the process, he's being chased and by a slave catcher, perhaps a former master. And he tells the person, "If you keep pursuing me, I'm going to kill you." And the man kept pursuing him for hours. And he stopped, turned around, and he killed the man. And he tells this before an audience of people in Canada. And they start to cheer and they say, "Bravo, you did right." And he says, "I thought I was a Christian. I hope I can still be considered a godly man." And the whole audience is saying, "It's a justifiable act." Um, and the chairman of the meeting says, "Does our friend look like a murderer?" And they affirm his decision to kill this person. And moreover, they affirm his identity as a Christian and as a godly man. And I think that's a really important story to tell in how we understand spirituality and self-defense working hand in hand.
Why would history want slavery? Why would it depict slavery to be ended by moral suasion and paternalism instead of what you argue did end slavery, violence or the threat of violence? What myth is moral suasion and paternalism ending violence or ending slavery? What is that enforcing or supporting?
I think that it kind of goes back to what I said a little bit earlier about how Americans have this false narrative and even romance with nonviolence that's not necessarily accurate. That we like to tell these stories because they're practical, because you can share them with children, because you can reiterate them as having had the moral high ground, right? As having done the right thing, as though the end of slavery was just about a change of heart. And we know that not to be the case. We know that the Civil War was not only a violent war, but it was the most deadliest war that we've ever experienced in American history. And I think that if we tell these stories about nonviolence and we dismiss or neglect to tell the stories about how violence accelerated and even brought about the demise of slavery, we will really never understand how these major moments happen. We'll never really understand how change is brought about. And we'll continue to operate using tools that are ineffective for other methods that we know to be true just based on the historical past.
I missed my button. It really enjoyed your book a lot. And one of the things you write is a retreat from engaging in a complex understanding of the political purposes of violence limits both how we see and make use of the past. Within the field, there is a propensity to privilege the performance of nonviolence and deny the possibility and utility of violence as the great accelerator in American emancipation. Now, just to play devil's advocate and hope that the people are trying to do the right thing, is privileging the performance of nonviolence and denying the possibility and utility of violence an attempt to break the cycle of violence? Is this an attempt, even if it's inaccurate history, at being opposed to violence generally, not only as a means to political change?
Mm. Gosh, that's a really good question. It's hard to answer a little bit because I think, no pun intended, but these things are much more black and white in the 19th century than they are in our 21st century context. That I think, I'm not a proponent of violence at all, at all. But I do understand how violence is effective, and more importantly, I understand how force is effective. And I think that if we're unwilling to examine how those tools work, we won't really understand how to construct the future that we want to have. So if you're building a house and you don't know what certain tools are for or how they work or their effectiveness, right? You're gonna have a huge problem when you try to live in that house and when you try to move in. So I think that it's not about necessarily saying that nonviolence is not useful, but it's about saying when violence is useful, what makes it so and why is it necessary? Um, you know, that's hard to do when we look at racism today because there's so much denial about what racism is, about what oppression is. And in some ways, that's the whole effectiveness of racism is that it makes it difficult to pinpoint what is wrong and what is right or what is discrimination and what is not. But it was very clear in the 19th century what slavery was. It was very clear that slavery was violence. And it was also very clear that violence would be the most effective tool in replacing that institution.
You write that with tensions rising in 1859, a radical abolitionist newspaper, the Anglo-African magazine, boldly declared that eventually Americans would have to choose between facing the bloodiest slave rebellion by black Americans or the armed attacks by white allies. So people, it's quoted in the paper, said, "So people of the South, people of the North, men and brethren, choose ye which method of emancipation you prefer, Nat Turner or John Brown's."
But John Brown.
Did
Yeah.
did
It's a
whites
great quote.
yeah did whites choose civil war over slave rebellion? Was the Civil War an attempt to avoid a bloody slave rebellion? Why would they choose civil war over slave rebellion?
Mm. I don't think that they necessarily chose civil war over slave rebellion, but I can say that the South, the Confederacy in particular, chose slaveholding at the risk of everything else, that they could not relinquish their economic and political and social power that slavery afforded them, and that they were so invested and, dare I say, enslaved to their own greed that they chose to go to war. It's South Carolina that shoots the first shots out of Fort Sumter. And I think that that is really telling that it's not so much about white radicals like John Brown trying to overthrow slavery, but more importantly, it's about how much the slave-holding South was trying to hold on to slavery at the risk of everything else. And that is something that I don't think that we talk about enough either. That violence was something that the South was heavily invested in to protect their own financial and political assets and their own white supremacy. And I think that even to this day, the efforts that people will go to protect the supremeness of whiteness or whiteness as an identity is really quite profound.
Malcolm X said, "Only by knowing where we've been can we know where we are and look to where we want to go." What can knowing about the role violence played in antebellum, anti-slavery black activism reveal about where African Americans are today? What impact can it have on where black activism wants to go, which is liberation?
I think that's a really good point. I think we've made a lot of great strides in a relatively short amount of time. But I also think that we have a long way to go. I don't think it's a coincidence that you get a Barack Obama presidency and a Black Lives Matter movement at the same time. I also don't think it's a coincidence that you get a Barack Obama presidency followed by a Trump presidency, right? A lot of these things are still ideas, concepts, and policies and heart changes that really need to be worked out in America. We talk all the time about how we need to have a conversation about race. We need to have a conversation about race. And, Black History Month this past year has been like the longest February on record in terms of like highs and lows, in terms of progress and where we are in terms of race and racism in today's world. And so what I hope Black abolitionists can do is that they can provide a model of how to think about, of how to engage in activism to not just protect humanity, but promote humanity, right? How do we create a world in which Black people are seen as human beings and respected as such? And so I'm not, I'm not a perfect person to answer that question with the best answer in the whole wide world. I think it's something that we each individually have to think about and think about where our strengths lie and how we can use our skills and talents to bring about a better world for everyone.
We have been speaking with historian Kellie Carter Jackson, author of Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. One last question for you, Kellie, and as we do with all of our guests, we call our final question the question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer, or our audience is going to hate your response. It's one of those three every time. So
Okay.
I could not, is violence the outcome of criminalizing activism? Because I couldn't help but think of the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel's occupation of Palestine while reading your book, and how the Trump administration, along with their supporters in Congress and people on the Democratic side as well, tried in December to criminalize the BDS movement. What can we learn from the criminalization of abolitionism? What can we learn from that makes us think that violence is the outcome of criminalizing activism?
My goodness, that's a tough question. I mean, I think that it's not, at least in the case of my work, it's not so much the criminalization of violence or the criminalization of abolition or the criminalization of activism as it is so much the criminalization of Blackness. So I tell my students a lot, there's this myth that white people commit crimes, but Black people are criminals. And that's a really troubling premise. If you think about the fact that, yes, a white person can steal, but that doesn't mean that they're a thief, as opposed to Black people don't necessarily have to commit crimes in order to be seen as threatening or dangerous. And I think it's the criminalization of Blackness that that really encapsulates how much of the struggle requires all methods of and tools for liberation in order to end this idea. If I go back to Joshua Easton, our tools really not to be necessarily about the overthrow of slavery, but the spirit of slavery, which makes color a mark of degradation. And I think that white supremacy is most afraid of not Black criminality, but Black humanity. What happens when Black lives do matter? And will it come at the expense of their own power and identity?
Kellie, this has truly been an amazing pleasure. The next time you have anything published, you ever put out when you put out your next book, whatever, make sure you contact us because I really want to have you back on the show. I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for being on our show this week.
Thank you for having me. Have a good day.
That's historian Kellie Carter Jackson, author of Force and Freedom, Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. You can follow Kellie on Twitter at @KCarterJackson, and you can find out more about Kellie at her website, KellieCarterJackson.com.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.